Good evening, everyone. We'll try it again. Good evening, everyone. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming to our event tonight. It's titled Red, Striped, or Blue, Examining the 2024 Elections with Polling and Election Experts. My name is Camille Burge-Hicks, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, where I also currently serve as department chair. And I'm also a member of the ABC News Election Night Decision Desk team. And I've had the privilege of being a member of the D-Desk community since the 2022 midterms. And it was from that point on that I realized what really happens on election night. It's not just the on-air media personalities lighting up maps and providing election projections. There are large teams of people on every network doing a great deal of work to analyze voting data as it comes in and call races in real time. It's a great deal of hard work that is rarely ever seen by the masses. And so tonight, I want to give you a glimpse into that world by having an enriching forum about how networks make their projections on election night and have you meet some of the key people involved in those decisions. But before we do that, I'd like to take a few seconds to explain what this panel is not going to do. This is not a discussion about pre-election polling. We're not here to provide critiques of election polling versus actual results. This is also not a riveting commentary on the political landscape or our varied opinions on the election outcomes. I think some of these things will naturally come up in the Q&A session at the end, but for now, we're here to learn from these election and polling experts about what goes on behind the scenes to bring you those red, striped, or blue results on your TV screens on election night. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. First, we have Jennifer Agiesta. She's the Director of Polling and Election Analytics at CNN. She leads the network's polling team and heads its election night decision desk and has been at CNN since 2015. She led a modernization of CNN's standards for reporting on polls and surveys and changed the way the network conducts its own polls to lean on cutting-edge methodologies. Prior to joining CNN, she covered polls and elections at the Associated Press and the Washington Post, and previously worked at Edison Research and Voter News Service. She also served as past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. Next, we have Kabir Kanna. Kabir is Deputy Director of Elections and producer of election analytics at CBS News, where he has worked since 2016. On election nights, he manages the network's data desk team to analyze live returns, identify trends, and ultimately project winners in national, state, and district races. He's responsible for the statistical methodology underlying the CBS Battleground Tracker, and also produces data-driven news segments on elections, polling, and politics. He sometimes sneaks in front of camera to break down data on air. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Princeton and has published academic works in journals such as Political Analysis and Harvard Data Science Review. We also have Joe Linsky. Joe Linsky is co-founder and executive vice president of Edison Research. Under his supervision, Edison Research currently conducts all exit polls for the major news organizations, comprising the National Election Pool, or the NEP, which you'll hear a lot about tonight. That's ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. Edison Research has conducted all state and national exit polling for the NEP since 2003. Edison Research has also conducted exit polls for national elections in Iraq, Venezuela, and the Republic of Georgia. Linsky has served on the Executive Council for the American Association for Public Opinion Research and as president of the New York chapter of APOR, that's what we call the organization. Linsky is a graduate of Princeton University and studied at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Next, we have Stephen Pettigrew. Stephen's a senior analyst on the NBC News Decision Desk. He's also the director of data science for the University of Pennsylvania's program on opinion research and election studies, and the deputy executive director of UPenn's Fox Leadership Program. He received his PhD in political science from Harvard University. We also have Scott Tranter. Scott is the director of data science for Decision Desk HQ which will be known throughout the night as DDHQ. Tranter leads the teams who make race projections on election nights and creates DDHQ's forecast models, polling averages, and live election night models, which have been published in the Harvard Data Science Review. Prior to working at DDHQ, Tranter founded a data science company, Optimus, which worked with political campaigns and brands in the market research space. He sold Optimus to Dynata, the world's largest first-party data platform, in 2021. Tranter holds a degree in finance from American University and an MA in national security and strategic studies from the US Naval War College, which he primarily applies to dominate games of Battleship. And last but certainly not least is our moderator, Kristen Conrad. Kristen is a senior vice president within the policy and polling division at SSRS, which is a full-service survey research firm. Leading a team of talented researchers, she offers methodological expertise and data insights to clients such as Marquette University Law School, which does routine polling nationally and in Wisconsin, and the Washington Post. Earlier in her career, she helped coordinate the national election polls and manage the ABC News Washington Post polls. She's been a member of the ABC News Decision Desk House team since 1994 and serves as a member-at-large for the Pennsylvania-New Jersey chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. Kristen holds a master's degree from the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And just as a note, I did contact Darren Shaw, who is the director of elections and the decision desk at Fox News earlier this semester, and unfortunately no one from their team was able to join us tonight. And then last week at the very last minute, I made contact with an incredible person named Emily Swanson, who people on this stage know very well. Emily is director of public opinion research at AP News, but she was unable to make it. And so I thank both of them for their consideration, and I hope that we can have another election event later that includes their very important perspectives. Finally, and I'll shut up, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Pennsylvania-New Jersey chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, especially Matthew Graham from Temple University and Kristen Conrad, with their assistance in planning and executing this event. Villanova's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and our Dean, Adele Lindenmeyer, is here tonight for their financial support. The Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest, with a huge thanks to Kevin for handling a great deal of the logistics for the event and for our panelists. My home Department of Political Science, tremendous thanks to Jessica Schwartz for handling our robust election event series this fall. The Department of Communication, the Department of Sociology and Criminology, and Villanova's Sector of Government Relations and External Affairs. So I'll turn it over to Kristen now to provide a history of election night projections and exit polling. Afterwards, we'll have a moderated panel discussion with Kristen and our panelists. We'll then open it up for audience Q&A and conclude. Again, many thanks for coming, and I hope that you enjoy this event.
Yes, so here's a list of our panelists, again, for your learning pleasure. Representing a variety of media outlets and points of view as far as the election is concerned and how we process all the information on election night. So we're going to focus on that. And what I want to talk about first is a little bit about the history of how we got here and provide you with some definitions as well. So before we start talking about the history, I just want to cover a couple different kinds of definitions. So the first is what we're going to be talking about tonight, as Camille said, is about projecting elections and how the media uses information on the night of the elections to project what is going to be happening in the country, whether it's going to become a red state, a blue state, the striped state, striping states that become blue or red, et cetera. So the first thing that the teams look at is they look at actual vote count. So as you may know, when you cast your ballot, the ballots are counted and they're aggregated at a local level, and different states do it in different ways. So some states aggregate and then they report the data at that local level. Others collect everything and pull it together at the state level and then report it out. So we'll talk about how that's done and how that's used on the night of the election. So the short term is vote count, or counting the vote, to talk about that piece, which is the actual vote. The other part of the process is to look at not necessarily what the vote count is, but also what we call exit polls, which are generally speaking polls that were conducted at the time of the election to learn a little bit more about the electorate. And they're not tied to the actual what you put in your ballot. That's a separate assessment that's sampled the night of the election and also has been more recently done in a way where we're sampling people as they do their, or if your state does an early voting situation where you can cast your vote early or you mail in your vote, you can be eligible to do a survey. And the use of that information is to learn a little bit about the whys and wherefores of why people may have voted for a particular candidate, why they might have supported a position, what things are important to them as they're making their vote decisions, and a little bit about their demographics, like their gender, their race, their education level, to get a little bit more information about the reasons that people vote and who's voting for whom. So with that, I'll just talk quickly about history of polling and exit polling on the night of the election. So I guess in the very beginning, in the 60s, in the ancient times of the 1960s, when we just had three networks, following the California primary, ABC, CBS, and NBC created what was known at that time as the News Election Service, which was the first network pool to report vote results. And during the 70s and most of the 80s, then ABC, CBS, and NBC conducted their own independent exit polls, and I know there are people here in the audience and also on the stage that were involved in some of those independent efforts in the beginning times. And at that time, also the LA Times was also doing its own exit polling for selected national and state elections. And the goal of all of this, again, was to provide vote tallying and exit poll results that news organizations and networks could report on election night and beyond. Then came the 90s. And the vote count was done prior to that and limited exit polls. But in 1990, ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN created what was known at that time as Voter Research and Surveys, or VRS, which was the first network pool to conduct exit polls to be used in by all of the news organizations. Then in 1993, VRS and the previously mentioned NES merged to form what was known then as Voter News Service, which combined the exit polls and the vote count functions into one consortium, and we'll talk about that evolution a little bit when we talk to the panelists. And then in 1996, Fox News, which was becoming much more of a force at that time in the 90s, joined VNS. And then, yeah, that's it. Okay. And then in 2003, the National Election Pool was created because there were some problems with exit polling and vote results in 2000s. And for those of us who lived through it, we remember what happened in 2000 and how challenging that was. So at that time, and VNS had been dissolved and the NEP was formed. And so that NEP group was ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, Fox, and then the Associated Press. And at that time also, NEP contracted with Edison Media Research and Mitofsky International, and Joe Lenski, who's on the far end of the panel, was leading that effort at Edison. And their goal was to provide the exit poll results and the election projection models, whereas AP was providing the vote. So there were basically two groups that were providing two different sources of information. AP was collecting and reporting the vote count to the networks, and then Edison was, via the NEP, was providing the services to to provide the exit poll results. Then more fun, in 2012, an upstart company came into existence that was different from from the rest of the organizations, and we're very excited to have Scott from DDHQ here, because his model and the way that he looks at polling and, vote count data on election night is a little different from the NEP, and so we'll explore a little bit about what he does and how that's different from the rest of the AP and NEP vote count data. So in 2012, they emerged onto the scene, and then in 2017, AP and Fox, because why would anything be simple and straightforward? AP and Fox left the NEP, and Edison took over the responsibility of projecting the vote results. So basically, there was a schism between the NEP where Edison would be taking over the vote count results and continuing to work on the exit polling side, and then AP and Fox were doing a separate effort where AP would be collecting the vote count. And at that time, there was a creation of something called AP Votecast, just to be even more confusing, which was administered by NORC at the University of Chicago, and they started that effort in 2018. Then in 2019, Reuters entered into a distribution partnership agreement with the NEP to sell subscriptions for NEP, exit poll, and vote count data as well. So even more organizations getting involved. Fast forward to 2024, the NEP is still strong and exists with its members ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC, where the exit poll, the election projection models, and vote results are provided by Edison Research, and Reuters also continues to use them. At this time, AP and Fox, as well as PBS, are continuing their separate collaboration with AP Votecast. And DDHQ is also providing election projections via online publications and also providing information to YouTube streamers. So it's an interesting space because it's really leaning into online sources and people that are seeking online sources for information that may be outside of the normal traditional networks. And I also wanted to mention that if you're a fan of print online media or print media, AP uses the vote data to report their own results, and the Washington Post uses NEP exit poll data. Wall Street Journal is an AP Votecast partner. New York Times uses AP vote data, and Ballotpedia, Scripps, and others use DDHQ. So you can see that the world has come together, it's split apart, it's come together, and it's an extremely interesting time to be involved in the vote projection. So with that, I'm going to have a seat, have a glass of water, and start to engage our friends here about what they do, a little bit about how they prepare, and we'll talk with some pre-prepared questions and then open it up to questions and answers that you may have. And hopefully our panelists will provide you with some really, really interesting insights about what goes on election night. Okay? So we'll see if this mic works now. Okay, so I have my prepared questions, and I'm going to start with Joe Lenski. So Joe, we're going to talk a little bit first about what happens before the election, because there's a lot of preparation that occurs to get things ready for election night. So I want to ask Joe a little bit about what is the role of NEP, and I guess you can proxy a little bit about AP since AP isn't here, about how you prepare for election night in terms of what kinds of efforts do you make to get things together so that the vote count and the exit polls can be provided to the outlets, the media outlets that provide it to the rest of the country and the world?
Thank you, Kristen. The preparation for Election Day is really a 4-year process. We sign a 4-year contract with the NEP members to prepare for all the elections during the election cycle, and what we're doing is constantly researching all the vote data at the precinct and county and state level. What's become even more important is researching vote by method. You mentioned earlier how many people now vote by mail or vote early or vote election day. Each of those types of voters have a different partisan skew in how they vote. And then the other part of what we do is put together a team that collects all this data on election day. So we have a team of hundreds of exit poll interviewers that go out to the 500 or 600 locations around the country where we're doing interviews on election day. We have dozens of interviewers that are interviewing early voter at early voting locations in critical states with large numbers of early voters like North Carolina and Georgia. And then we're also preparing reporters to go to individual counties to get the actual vote reports on election day. So we're gathering all this information. On election day, there'll be over 3,000 or 4,000 individuals working for Edison for that day to gather all that information, whether it's the exit poll information, whether it's precinct reports, whether it's county or state reports, and we have a whole team also monitoring all the feeds and websites with these reports. And the clearinghouse for the NEP to gather all this data and distribute it to them in a way that their decision teams can use to make their projections on election night.
Great. And then as far as how do you choose, you said something about 600 locations. How do you choose what locations are selected to be representative of America?
Yeah, I mean, that's a collaborative process with the NEP members. They allocate the resources to which states and how big the exit poll will be. So this year we did 10 state exit polls and then a national exit poll to cover all 50 states. In each of those states, we pick what's a probability sample. You take past results and you sort them in a way that you can randomly select a sample of precincts that represents the voter distribution in the state, whether it's by geography, by demographics, by past vote, and that's the sample that you use on election night to gather the current data and compare it with the past and see what differences have occurred over the last 2 years, the last 4 years in that process.
Okay, great. And then as far as you said you collect a lot of information on what's called vote by method, which is basically, did they mail in their vote? Did they vote on election day? Are they in a place where they can do early voting? How do you make sure that the voices of those people are also heard on election night?
Yeah, what we call an exit poll, and you talked about how it was developed in the 60s and 70s, back when 95% of voters voted on election day at their local polling place. I'll do a quick poll here. How many people actually voted at their polling place on election day this year? I'm going to guess that's about 40%. That's what the average was around the country. How many of you vote by mail? Okay, nationally that was about 30% of the vote this year. And how many voted in person at an early vote location? You represent about another 30% of voters. So as more and more people have taken advantage of early voting and by mail opportunities, we've evolved the methodology of the exit poll. So the exit poll, even though we still call it an exit poll, it has that brand name and people understand the exit poll as a survey of voters. It's a multi-mode survey now. So we're doing interviews at 600 locations around the country on election day to represent the 40% of voters that vote on election day. We did dozens of locations to represent the early voters, and that's a process that starts 2 or 3 weeks before election day when people start casting early ballots. And those voters, we know are voters because we're talking to them right after they vote. We're handing them a questionnaire, they fill it out privately, anonymously, and then we record the results and transfer them back to our computer systems to distribute to the members. But then the last chunk, the 30% that vote by mail, we contact through a multi-mode survey of a registration-based sample. So we take voter registration lists around the country, sample them, and then contact them either by phone, cell phone or landline, email, or text to web. And that's how the folks we can't talk to in person, because we can't talk to them at a polling center, we contact through those methods, and they're included in the full voter survey that we produce.
Great. Okay, I'd like to turn to Scott for a second. I'd like to ask you kind of the same question because the way you prepare for the election is a little bit different from what Joe would do to prepare. So could you talk a little bit about what DDHQ does and how they prepare for election night?
Sure, and I don't know that it's too much different from what Joe described. So we have an operation we collected from 3 primary ways. We have people who monitor websites, we have people who show up at voting locations, and then we have a scraping operation because some of these counties and voting count units, as we call them, put it out publicly. We are going to cover about 45,000 elections this cycle because we go all the way down to the municipal level. And so every election, every primary is preparation. It's a practice session coming up in November. And so that's kind of where our preparation stands, both from a vote collection method. On election night, I think we probably had a little bit less people than Joe. We probably had about 800 people out in the field, and we had about 300 people in the headquarters on election night processing things. So head count's a little bit lower, and that's primarily, we look at it as there's about 38 states in which you can collect the data via websites and things like that, at least at a state level. So there's pretty good coverage there. The other thing we look at, and I'm sure Joe's team does it as well, is there's quite a bit of trend analysis, right? Just, hey, what did this look like in the primary? What did this look backwards? When we get to election night and we're looking at these returns, we already have our vote goals calculated out. We have these things, which I'm sure everyone does. But that's quite a bit of homework, and that doesn't start at Labor Day. That starts months ahead of time.
Great, thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn to the NEP members, represented here by Kabir, Jen, and Steve. So CBS, CNN, NBC. Can you each talk about your preparation at your end? So Joe is busy recruiting people to collect the vote. He's sampling precincts. He's gathering information. He's looking at past information, building models, and trying to prepare so that all of the data can be collected on election night and sent to you. So how do you prepare to receive that data? And can you tell us each a little bit about what your network is doing in terms of how the data might be used or how you feed it to your broadcasters?
I'll jump in and talk kind of just broadly about what all the networks are doing, which is that when we get to election night, we've practiced election night dozens and dozens and dozens of times. That starting in August, I think, or actually I think it was July. It was mid-late July. We had our first election simulation where Joe's team is basically pushing through election results into our systems for us to test things like making sure our models work, making sure our graphics work, making sure everything's going to work. Because when we get to election night, we can't figure out then that all of a sudden we have a problem with the code that's making the graphics or something like that. But it also provides an opportunity for us to go into election night and ideally not be surprised by what happens, right? We want to have no matter what happens politically, no matter who wins, who loses, what ends up happening, we want to be in a situation where we've seen it before, where we've done a rehearsal, where we've seen a night where the Republicans do really well, or we've seen a night where the Democrats do really well, or we've seen a night where it's tied, so that we've worked through our processes internally to talk about, okay, well, if we're seeing this, how is that going to affect the way that we project this race or that race? And so that's something I think that all of us are doing. We're all involved in these rehearsals, and they're every other week for the whole fall, and then we do full dress rehearsals essentially over the 2 or 3 weekends before election day, where it's not just I don't know how it works at other networks, but for us at NBC, like, it's not just our team on those weekend dress rehearsals, it's all the talent. It's Steve Kornacki at the big board looking at the simulation data and like thinking about how he's going to talk about things on TV, 3 or 4 days later when it's actual real data. And so that's a huge part of what takes up our time. And there's a lot of other things, but I'll let you all add on.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit about sort of the forward-facing preparation that we do, because I think Joe and Stephen have kind of covered really well what we do to get our decision teams ready. But the part of sort of preparing to present the results to the public, that starts right now for 4 years from now. What we're already thinking about is what pieces of the data were we happy with our presentation of? What do we want to change? What were we missing? How can we do this differently? How can we do it better? And we have a whole team at CNN that works on this constantly in the background of our production. For election night itself, because we're a 24-hour news network, we have 4 production teams that we have to prepare for our election coverage so that any one of them can be handling projections and election results at any point throughout the election week, what has become really a standard. And so me and my team, we're working with all of those folks all the way through. It starts with data feeds in July, but even before then, we're thinking about who's going to be involved, what the different pieces are, who's going to stand in front of what graphic, and what those graphics will look like, and what they will say, and what the font is, and making sure that every little piece of that comes through correctly. So it's not just making sure we understand how to make a projection, it's making sure we understand how to explain it to you, and to make sure that what we're presenting to the public makes sense.
I think it sounds like we all prepare pretty similarly. We're doing the same thing now at CBS. We're rewinding the tape, talking through what worked well on election night in terms of the public-facing explanations and graphics and maps. But we're also looking back at the data we got and the models that we ran on election night, which are all timestamped, to talk about which models performed well, where were we able to get data that we didn't get before, and what did we learn from it. All those conversations are starting now. And while it is a 4-year preparation, I will say it ramps up exponentially in the election year, particularly with the primaries in a presidential year. We'll probably touch on this, but a lot of the staff at the decision desk at the networks aren't full-time. So like most of the people I work with at the data desk are academics or data scientists or survey researchers who have other jobs and consult with CBS. So bringing them in early in a presidential election year, those simulations that Edison is feeding us is huge, because it not only allows us to make sure that our graphics are firing and the pipelines are running, so to speak, but we talk through those as if it were election night, like Stephen said, and have discussions. If you saw this in Pennsylvania, this fake data, which is like based on a past election and probably very realistic, what would we do in this situation? What would we be able to say? What would we be able to tell the public? What would we not know yet? And those conversations we had for the good part of the fall, and they were kind of the most useful preparation we did, I think, to get in the headspace we would be in on the night of November 5th.
Yeah, when I started in this business in 1988, I'm this 22-year-old kid starting in the business, and I thought election nights just happen. I had watched election nights, and they just happen. And then I start in this process. Like, we rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. We did 27 data simulations between the end of July and November 5th, and I thought, oh, guys like Steve Kornacki and John King, they're just so good on their feet. It's a lot of practice, a lot of rehearsals, as Stephen said, a lot of preparing for different possibilities, so if this state reports late, or if this state reports its early vote before its election day vote, how that will look like. And I think that's probably the most surprising thing to someone who just consumes the broadcasts on TV, is how much time and practice has gone into preparing for election night.
Great, thank you. So Kabir touched on the idea that the decision desks, the people that are helping with the projections, are made up of people that work at the network but come from other places. And I'd like to ask each person here to talk a little bit about your decision desk and who are the people, what kind of people are there, how did they prepare, where do they come from, what is their role, how is it set up? There are a lot of races between all of the House races, between the Senate races, referendums, the presidential race, of course, 50 states plus DC. How does that all get managed at the network level?
I can start on this. It'll be interesting to hear how we're similar and different. But so on election night, we scale up to around 15 people around the data desk who are dedicated to sort of analysis of the data, making projections, generating insights. There are other people who help with communications and graphics and sort of the broader operation at the news network. So that group of people, as I mentioned, a lot of them come from the academic world. So we have professors of political science and data science. We have folks from the survey research world. So YouGov is a partner for a lot of CBS pre-election polling. We have some of the key people there also at the data desk helping us with live data returns and voter poll analysis. And the way typically the teams divvied up is there's one small group that focuses exclusively on the House, which is kind of its own beast with hundreds of races around the country. That group is led by currently Kyle Kondik at CBS, who's at the University of Virginia, Crystal Ball. Some of you may read his newsletter, and along with some assistants basically helping him. The statewide races at various levels are typically divvied up where we have teams of like small clusters of analysts looking at every key presidential, Senate, gubernatorial contest, and even the ones that aren't battlegrounds. So typically what we do is we have a point person for each of those contests and 2 to 3 analysts working with them, and they're sort of a funnel of information. So those folks who are, let's say, assigned to Pennsylvania might be the first to notice an important vote update or a model kind of converging into a good estimate. That information basically makes its way to me and then eventually to the person I report to and eventually gets on air. But the important thing is we have multiple people basically looking at all of the important races and multiple layers of review, so to speak. And for important decisions we make, it's often a process of reaching consensus among those different analysts to make sure, let's say we're ready to make a projection in a big state, nobody has any red flags, any strong cautions before we enter a significant call like that.
I would say at NBC, it's interesting to hear how you all are organized because we're organized almost exactly the same, which is to say we have a house team, and I've been in charge of the house team the past couple cycles, but then for the statewide races, we have a handful of analysts assigned to each. And I just want to underscore that our process is very similar in terms of, especially on big calls where consensus is like the way that we operate, that we all trust each other, and so if any one person has any concern about a race that they can vocalize and say I really think this evidence is, or this data is suggesting that this might not be ready to call, then we don't call it. We're fortunate enough, and in our organization that we want to be fast with the calls, but we have to be right. One of my colleague, Mark Trussler, he likes to say that when we make a good call that ends up being correct, and if we're the first one to make the call, we win 10 points. But if we miss a call, if we get it wrong, it's minus 1 billion points. So that's sort of that's where we're kind of our frame of mind about these things, and so that's why being on a team where we trust each other and we operate largely on consensus and everybody agreeing that nobody has any of those red flags is so important to us.
Yeah, our setup is quite similar. Within our little different teams that we have, what we've tried to do is pair someone who has a really strong political background with someone who has a very strong statistical background, so that you have someone who can really understand deeply what the models are saying and why and what the theories are behind that, with someone who can tell you exactly why Erie County is so important. And I think that model has worked really well for us. So those teams are each assigned to a group of states. Some of them have house assignments similar to what you guys described. Their projections go up to sort of a lead team, and then that team reviews it. If they're good with it, it comes to me. And then for my final sign off, and then I'm the one who's talking to the control room and making sure that everything gets conveyed to television, to our audience, to our digital platforms, all at the same time and accurately.
Yeah, and the other part that's going on is we're all in communication with each other. So at Edison, we have a conference line set up with each decision team at each of the 4 networks, and that is the opportunity for feedback. So that's for any questions that they see in our data. Is is this really right? Is that the right turnout that we should be expecting here? Is that really early vote, or should that be by mail vote? Any check on our data, that's a cooperative effort. And then we also, on the really big races, it's not only consensus within each of the networks, we have a consensus among the group for the really big calls. In the end, each network has their own editorial responsibility and makes calls independent of the group. But for really critical calls, we're all in the same boat. And if any of us makes a mistake, we all look away. We all lose that 1 billion points. Yes. if we make a call. So we're very cognizant of what the response is going to be to any call we make, and we all make sure we have that consensus before any of the really critical calls are made.
Great. Scott?
So we're mostly the same. We're decision desk is about 10 people. To be on it, you have to have worked a considerable amount of races ahead of time in the primary and performed well. It ranges. We have, on one end of the spectrum, we have a kid from Yale who has really earned his spot on there. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a disgruntled Ph.D. in astrophysics who sits there and knows more about counties than I ever wish to know, and a whole lot in between. But the group has, by and large, been together since 2016, more or less. We've added a few people, reduced a few people. The way we assign states is a little bit different. It's a little bit fantasy football-like in the sense that people get to say, hey, I really want to do Pennsylvania, or I really want to do Florida, or I want to do these congressionals. Not everyone gets everything they want, but we start with that. And there's a reason for that. It's mostly because, again, if you're on the decision desk, and I imagine it's the same for everyone else, you're a political nerd. You're not doing this for a job. You're not doing it for the money. You're doing this because you'd probably be sitting at home watching this on TV, like Jeopardy, answering all the questions. And so we want to make sure people are there doing what they want to do, because once they pick it, then there's quite a bit of homework, right? So before they're allowed to be on election night, I have them write out trigger points. So they have to understand, I think we should call Pennsylvania based on this. And the first thing we tell them is half your trigger points are going to be wrong. But I want to know that you've been thinking about it ahead of time when we put some of these things. And by wrong, someone's trigger point for Pennsylvania this year for presidency was, well, until all the provisionals are counted. Well, that wasn't the case. But that's an example of a trigger point that people were thinking about it. They did their homework ahead of time. And so that's kind of how we look at it. We do it very similar to these folks. You have to have consensus. And consensus for what we call top-tier races. So a top-tier race would say Pennsylvania for president or a statewide. Not necessarily a top-tier race would be a state-led race call, something like that. You need 3 people, and I'm the 3rd person. For the non-top-tier ones, it's 2 people, and they have to put it in there, and it goes out there. The only other major difference after listening to this is we don't take any input from any of our clients on this. It's actually pretty strict in our contract with all of our media partners. I don't want to hear their opinions about when something should be called or whether they think something would be there. And, it's pretty explicitly told that I told the president of News Nation, Nexstar, multi-billion-dollar company, I was like, I will not be picking up your phone on election night if you think something's wrong. In fact, I will actively tweet out our answer and then maybe call you back a day later.
So do your partners decide when they want to release it, or how does that work?
So that's a good question. So if they use our data, they use our calls. If they don't use our data, they don't have to use our calls. And what that means is we have clients across the political spectrum. They can't take our data, we call a certain state a certain way, and then they say, no, we're going to switch it the other way. They don't have to take the call, but they can't take our data and then go against the call. And that's, we put that very explicitly in the contracts. We have a team that, outside of the race call team, that monitors that. We haven't had any issues with that, but again, we don't want anyone using our data to say, hey, I know DDHQ said this, but we're going to go the other way.
Great. Okay, so I have a slight question for the rest of the networks then. Do you assign states by a fantasy football kind of approach, or how do you decide?
I gave folks, so we have some senior analysts who've been at CBS on the desk since before me.
Condit wanted Ohio, didn't he? I mean, there's no way he wasn't going to take Ohio.
Kyle is an Ohio expert, yes. So in addition to doing the House, he was pulled into key races, and the Sherrod Brown Marino Senate race is one of them. But some of the other senior analysts have been looking at the same states for years, and it makes sense because they know those states really well. So every 4 years, so-and-so has Arizona, so-and-so has Pennsylvania, and I offered them the chance, like, hey, and you want to make any trades, any swaps this year? And no, people stuck with what they were comfortable with. I haven't thought about a draft, though. Maybe next time.
Yeah, draft might be fun. It's a similar setup for us. We have some people who seem to be sort of pretty expert in certain states, and so they tend to get that state every single time. But we're also considerate of sort of the flow of the night and when these things are going to be projectable and when there's going to be a lot of activity. Like, you don't want to give the same person like Florida and Texas, right? Because that 8 o'clock hour is going to be insane for them. But you can sort of spread it out based on poll close times and what we know of past reporting times and when we expect certain things to sort of hit a critical mass.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we think through in, as a group, but also within our network, is like roughly getting a sense of how much vote we're going to get at various points in the night and when that might mean we would be calling some of these races. And so a lot of dividing up the states and dividing up that work, a lot of that is making sure we spread everything out evenly, that we don't give one group of analysts every one of the 7 presidential swing states, that we divide those evenly. But then also all of the races where it's like, I can promise you that the Republican is going to win the Idaho presidential race. Like, we spread those out evenly too, because we need eyes on those. We still have to put in those check marks, but we want to make sure that the work is spread out in that way as well. And I would just say, like, if we were doing a draft, I imagine that Alaska and Hawaii are often the last states to go just because they're so much later, and nobody ever wants those on our team.
Yeah, they want those because they go to bed early. They're like, we'll wake up at 5 a.m.
So that actually raises a question. How late were you all up on election night this year? Or in the morning?
Well, I woke up. I had planned to sleep until 8 the night before, and I just was up at 5:30, and then we were at the decision desk until like 5:45, 6, and it took me like 90 minutes to fall asleep when I got back to my bed. So.
Yeah, I left at 7 a.m.
8, yeah. About the same thing.
I left at 4 p.m. So
Yeah.
I do about a 36-hour.
For the record, we tried to get Joe to sleep. We did.
It was roughly Joe around 4:30. Yeah, I went home. But yeah, it's funny how the shifts have to work, right? Especially after 2020, we actively game that on our side because with a 10-person team, everyone wants to stay up till 5 a.m. because they think it's gonna be called. But we actually need like warm bodies who aren't, full of caffeine and nicotine to focus.
Yeah, we even do that.
So that's a really important question. So how do you keep the D-Desk members motivated? I had heard a rumor that CNN was going to be serving pancakes the morning of.
We do breakfast. There is breakfast.
So how do you keep the D-Desk folks going through the course of the night?
I mean, we have a fabulous special event staff that makes sure that we are fully fed and fully caffeinated all the way through the whole ride. So there's usually, a dinner around normal dinner time, and then we get like second dinner at like 11 p.m. and then there's like breakfast sometime around 3:34ish, just to make sure everybody's still going. But we it's hard. It's a long haul.
Yeah, food and snacks and a fridge full of drinks is helpful. I would just share that like my first general election was 2018, and I was working on the House team that night, and one of the things that that just stuck with me from that night was that the night started 6 o'clock. We start getting votes, and then the next time I really looked at the clock, it was 2:30, and I didn't feel like any time had passed. It just moved so quickly. I mean, our room doesn't have any windows, where it's brightly lit, like it's like you're in a casino, and so it's easy to lose track of that time. But then when you do look at the clock and you realize that it's 2 in the morning or 5 in the morning, then it hits you, and that can be kind of rough.
My first time was 2016, and it felt like I was in The Matrix. Maybe a dated reference, hopefully not, but where it felt like time was slowing down in certain instances, like around a poll closing, a minute felt like an eternity, but then at the same time, before you know it, it's 2:30 a.m., 4 a.m., whatever. CBS does not have the CNN pancake budget, unfortunately. So we're running on adrenaline and just being political junkies, and a lot of us would have been up all night looking at this at home if we weren't doing it.
Yeah,
for our jobs.
You have to enjoy that thrill of anticipation and curiosity of what the data is going to be. And also, millions of people are watching your work in real time. My first boss at CBS, Warren Matofsky, told a story in the 60s. He hired someone to manage the election night operation who used to work for NASA, thinking this guy that used to oversee space launches could deal with the pressure. And after one election, the guy came to us, I can't deal with this. The space launches, at least if it wasn't working, we'd stop the countdown and fix it. We can't stop the countdown here. The polls are going to close, the votes are going to get counted, and we got to be ready for that.
We spent $12,000 on food from Monday night till Wednesday morning. And I didn't know there was that much Celsius in the DMV area. That's what I will say. We had a live camera on our war room all night for some of the media partners, and it was interesting because we got a couple complaints. So, like, one of the tricks we use to keep them in there is we have bean bags, and so like they can lay in a bean bag while they're off shift eating a donut, which the TV partners love. But those are the tricks we do to keep everyone there and motivated.
I would just throw in there too, and this is so one of the things that because we have this connection with the University of Pennsylvania, we had several dozen students working with us on election night this cycle. And one of the things that I think that, to Joe's point, one of the things that keeps me going is knowing that the people in our room and the people in all of your rooms, we're kind of the first people in the world to know who's going to win this election, right? It's a question everybody in the world cares about, who's going to win the presidential election. And it's super motivating to know, like, the harder I work, the quicker I find out the answer for myself, and I get to share that with everybody else. It's so cool. It's like I can't underestimate that part, at least for me, of just like how motivating that is to do this work and to stay up late.
So given that, what's your favorite part about being in the D-Desk? Is that it, or are there other pieces that you really like about being part of this
I
process?
didn't say I liked it. No. I love it. It's great. I think that probably is. It's very cool to feel. I don't know. Just the. I don't have a background in journalism. I have a background in political science and data science, and so. But I can see the kind of. The pull of journalism to like know something before others do, and then get to share that with others. That's very cool to me personally.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think Stephen and I have a similar background in terms of our training, more in the academic social science world. It's having that front row seat to history and being able to apply a lot of the skills I picked up in terms of, rigorous data analysis. And the harder you work on election night, you know things faster, and you also gain more confidence, and you build that consensus. You're working with a team that has a diversity of backgrounds in terms of their training, of perspectives, of ideologies. And yeah, it's just really gratifying to work in that super fast-paced, kind of intense environment and on a very public stage.
I always tell the people we interview, election night's an adrenaline sport for nerds, right? Like it is. You've got to really want to do it, and you've got to really want the stress, as Joe pointed out. That's an interesting story because we've had some people over the years who are like very smart and they want to be there, but there is a lot of weight in terms of what you have to do. You have to do it in a short time frame, and you are doing it where it is a minus a billion points very publicly if you don't carry a zero correctly.
Yeah, I do have more of a journalism background than I think my fellow panelists do, and I feel like there is nothing cooler in journalism than when an entire newsroom is pulling in the same direction, when we're all rowing the same way and telling the same story and seeing the full power of what journalism can do is like exactly what makes election night so exciting for me. It is, informing people of something that is very relevant to their lives and making sure that we get the story right. And that's what I find most exciting about it.
I would just add one other thing, which we actually do talk a lot about on our team, which is that this stuff is important. Like, especially in this political moment we're in right now, it's really important for the American public to have confidence in our elections, and everybody on our team feels like there's an important normative quality to the work that we do, and that like covering elections well and informing the public with accurate, good information is also really motivating. It's important work, and that's something that I think drives me as well.
Awesome. So I want to ask a little bit about the exit polls. I think sometimes exit polls are misconstrued, and how they're being used on election night might be misconstrued as well. So could you each talk a little bit about the exit poll piece? So we know we collect the vote count to help project the winners, but how is the exit poll being used at each of your locations?
Well, I like to tell everyone who will listen to me that we use the exit poll to explain why and to explain how. It's not as much about the what. We're not really using it for projection purposes. It's really there to help us get the texture of why voters made the choices they did, and to know for sure that we're really talking to voters. That's something you don't often get in polling. You can't be 100% certain that your likely voters are actual voters until after the fact. But when we've gone out and we've talked to people at early voting locations and at polling places on election day, we know for sure that we have talked to voters and we know what they're saying to us. And that's really important information to help explain what's happening. I think especially given the degree of polarization in the country right now, people don't necessarily have neighbors who have politically different views than them. So one of the most important pieces of reporting on any kind of polling, and exit polling especially, is that it provides an opportunity to sort of explain what the representative public looks like and thinks, and what they feel in a way that people have a hard time seeing in their everyday lives.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Maybe just some examples of the things Jen was talking about are things like what were on voters' minds. We were talking to them right after they cast their ballot. It is a large, sophisticated, and very timely survey of actual voters. You also get a preliminary read on things like how different segments of the electorate broke, maybe a preliminary read on trends compared to the last election. So we use it really to tell those kinds of data-driven stories on election night. And as Jen said, we're not really using it these days to make projections, so to speak. So it's trying to get a sense of why people made the decisions they made.
Yeah, and as we produce this, the data is being updated throughout the day. We have the morning interviews get incorporated, and the afternoon interviews get incorporated. All this data is embargoed. There's only a limited number of people at each news organization that can see this data before 5 o'clock, and then at 5 o'clock, that data, which includes all the early voter surveys, all the by-mail voter surveys, and the first 2 waves of election day surveys are released to the networks. And my goal is to make sure the story that data tells, the big picture story that data tells, is it accurately prepares each of the networks and the journalists at each of the networks for the story they're going to get that night. I don't know how you guys briefed your folks shortly after 5 o'clock, but the data was telling me this race is close, but Trump seems to have an edge, or at least a lot of tea leaves leading to him having an edge in these battleground states. We didn't know the exact numbers. I mean, and a lot of these states ended up being within the margin of error, so we'd never know precisely. But I thought at 5 o'clock we had produced an exit poll that gave everyone the big picture of what to expect that night, and that's my goal when we're producing this data.
So quickly, what happens to the exit poll after election night?
The exit poll is consistently revised until we get the final data. We want the exit poll to most accurately represent who voted. And in fact, just the last few days, we've been getting the final breakouts of early vote and by-mail vote and election day vote. And so we've adjusted the exit poll to match that, so we know exactly the size of each vote by method. We know the vote in many states by each method. And once we do those final adjustments to the exit poll to match the actual results, those data get archived. You can go to the Roper Center at Cornell and get the data set for every exit poll since 1972, I believe, is archived there. And it's one other thing we're proud of with the exit poll. This is a process that has gone on over 50 years. We've done 14 presidential elections, 14 midterm elections with exit polls, and you can trend how the electorate has changed and what issues have changed and what demographics have changed over the last 52 years by tracking the exit polls.
Great. So let's talk about 2024, this year. What were the biggest surprises that you had as far as when you started to see the vote count and how that process worked at each of your organizations? Like, what were the big surprises, and how did that unfold for you?
I would just say I'm struggling to come up with one, just because, as I said earlier, like, we try to go into election night not being surprised, and I think Joe's team did a good job of preparing us by, you doing these simulations in a way that we had seen a scenario similar to what ended up ultimately being the final result. And so, so I'm just going to punt on the question. Maybe somebody else has a better.
Well, what I think was somewhat surprising, at least to me, was the degree of change that happened at the presidential level, yet at the same time, we're probably going to wind up with a very similar composition of the House in the end. So, it's an interesting division that you wouldn't necessarily have expected given sort of the way that politics has been trending in the US. And I think that sort of split ticket behavior, to some degree in the Senate and also to the House, is the one thing that sort of caught me a little by surprise.
I was going to say, just to add that if you had told me in June that Donald Trump was going to get 300 plus electoral votes, potentially win the popular vote, and then only have 220, 221 seats in a GOP House, I'd be like, that's not real. And on top of that, maybe not win, all the upper Midwestern states, assuming he wins all the 7 battlegrounds. That is not a trend, had you told me in June, that I would have bet on. And I think actually this scenario, because we do a forecast model, I think that showed up in like 6% of our simulations. So it's not like impossible, but that was not a likely one.
Yeah, it is a hard question to answer. I didn't have the same visceral sense of surprise that I did have in 2016, which was kind of my first rodeo. I will say there were some indicators early in the night that kind of surprised me. So one, I remember talking with Kyle, and the House team was Loudoun County, Virginia. So it's like a kind of affluent, educated DC suburb, showing some substantial gains, so a shift to the right, at least at the presidential level. The magnitude of that told us early, before we were ready to make any big projections, that Trump's on track for a good night. And then obviously lots of data points like that started building up throughout the night. Like Stephen said, we had rehearsed for this scenario. I don't think any of us were that surprised about the Trump win, nor were we surprised that he swept the 7 battleground states. Those states tend to break the same way. He won 6 out of 7 in 2016. Biden won 6 out of 7 4 years ago, and they were all very close in the pre-election polling. But the statistical uncertainty told you that they could easily all break the same direction. That's basically what happened. And then one other one I'll say that's like maybe a little bit of a surprise, but again, there was some signal before the election it could happen. It's kind of wonky, but the gap between the national popular vote and the tipping point state, which we're in, basically vanished this year. So in past elections, Democrats have tended to do much better in the national popular vote than in the decisive states. That happened 4 years ago, it happened in 2016. But what ended up happening this year, and we didn't really know this early on election night, but the pictures become clearer and clearer. There was a broad-based shift to the right. I'm just talking about people's vote choice at the top of the ticket. And sometimes that shift was even bigger in deeply blue states. So Trump gained in the battleground states, but he gained even more in kind of safe states that he didn't win. But that helps explain why that gap between the popular vote and the decisive states kind of vanished this year.
And what I like to see is the little things we pick up in the exit poll actually being confirmed when you see the vote count. So I think probably one of the most interesting numbers we saw in the very early exit poll results was the Hispanic vote and Latino men voting for Trump. And that was a change from before. And then when we see the vote data later in the night, Trump won Miami-Dade County for the first time a Republican presidential candidate had won in a long time. He won a lot of Rio Grande Valley, Texas counties. Even in New Jersey, he won Passaic County in New Jersey, which no Republican had carried for years, high Hispanic population. So it's kind of nice when we see those little indicators in the exit poll, and then when the votes come in, they tend to match the trends that we saw in the exit poll.
What is one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about what you do on election night?
That we call races, right? I always have to explain to people just because we call it, the states have to certify it. And I know I'm being a little pedantic, but I'm sure we've all gotten the emails on this stage like, why did you call this? Let it count. I was like, well, that's not our role here is to narrate and provide context for what's going on. It's the state's jobs a month from now, and you would also be complaining if no one spoke about a race for 6 weeks while we waited for the counties to certify. So it is a misconception about what our role is. I know the AP's not here. They like to say they've been doing it for 150 years, and they're very good at it, but everyone still projects it.
Yeah, I would, just to piggyback off of that and getting back to the point I said earlier about kind of the role in terms of informing the public, like if we're not doing it, somebody's gonna do it. And like what I mean by that is, if there are people out there who say that it's inappropriate for the media to even do this exercise at all, to project these races at all. I mean, it's not most people, but those voices exist out there because they say the states certify the results, and it's, the state will tell us eventually what the final winner was, and it's not the responsibility of the media to project what that winner is. But the reality is, even in states that certify the quickest, it takes a couple days at least. And so it just leaves a vacuum where if the media weren't engaged in this enterprise, somebody would, and and it just creates the possibility that, you know, bad actors create doubt about the outcome. I think one of the values of this enterprise is cutting down the uncertainty. Everybody woke up on election day not knowing what was going to happen, and everybody woke up the next day finding out what happened. And if we didn't do this exercise, then that wouldn't have been the case necessarily, and there would have been a vacuum for people to suggest what happened. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And echoing what Scott said, one of my pet peeves is when people say the media declares winners. You know, we don't declare anything. The states certify the votes. In fact, we don't even characterize which way a race is leaning until polls close. So, you know, sometimes people say, you know, just let the voters vote. That's exactly what we're doing. So the exit poll data that was mentioned, that is embargoed. We don't use it to tell people which way a race is trending until everyone's done voting, nor do we use the other models we're running on vote count data. So people, I guess it's a misconception, maybe misunderstanding, confusion. People sometimes think of what we're doing as like forecasting, which is kind of a different enterprise. I kind of think of what we do as more a missing data problem. Everyone has voted. The data is revealed to us like pieces in a puzzle, and we're basically just trying to fill it in using a variety of methods, and basically telling people what we're seeing in that missing data problem and filling it in for the public after the votes have been cast.
Intermediate algebra, as I like to call it.
Advanced.
Well, and that's the other part. We all have computer models. We all have ways we're comparing the current data, the past data, and projecting out the different ways that the data will end up once all the missing data is reported. But all our computer models just indicate to us when races are potentially callable. Our computer models are usually programmed to 99.5% confidence.
I was going to ask that because I was
But we're beyond
Yeah.
99%. We have to be 100%
Right.
correct. And no call goes out without human beings looking at those models, skilled human beings with a lot of experience looking at those models and thinking of all the different possible outcomes and saying, no outcome can reverse this result. We've thought of all the possible ways the rest of the vote can come in, and we are certain at this point that this person will end up with more votes.
Otherwise, minus 10 billion points, right?
Yes, and I do think there is a misconception that no one actually believes us when we say we don't want to be first, we want to be right, but that really is true. That really is the motivating factor behind everything that we're doing. Right is so much more important than first.
And how do you balance that with the people at the studio who are like, why haven't you called Wisconsin yet?
I mean, you know, we explain to them all the reasons why we're holding back, and the wonderful thing is that they listen to me, which is great. And I hope you guys have similar experiences.
To the earlier question about preparation beforehand, part of what we do is we work with those people beforehand to set expectations. And we tell them, you know, when our team is talking to them about Wisconsin, we tell them there's pretty much no scenario we're calling Wisconsin until we see the Milwaukee mail ballots. And Milwaukee has told us they're not coming until 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. So you set those expectations beforehand so that they aren't on your tail about why haven't you called Wisconsin, because we told them we weren't going to until, I mean, I guess one surprise to me was we were expecting it to take until Wednesday, that we didn't think we would get, I didn't think I was going to go to bed on Tuesday night and having called the presidency, and we got there, and so that was a bit of a surprise. But that was something where we sort of set the expectation that it would take longer, and so it worked out in our favor that they weren't pestering us because we had primed them to think it wasn't going to be until Wednesday.
And that history has changed. I mean,
Yes.
when I first worked at CBS in 1980, when each network had their own exit poll, it was a competition. You know, being the first network to call it was an important thing. And guess what? We made mistakes. If you go back and watch the 1988 CBS broadcast, you'll see we called Dukakis the winner in Illinois, and Bush ended up winning. If you look at the ABC broadcast, they called Dukakis the winner in Maryland, and Maryland ended up going for Bush. In the time when there were only 3 networks and no one was videotaping and rewatching and capturing video of the broadcasts, those mistakes just went away. Now everyone is watching everything. It's on. Everyone has it, has the video of it. Everyone has evidence on the internet. You cannot afford to be lax or irresponsible in these calls because you're going to be called out for it. And you can tell now how serious we are about what we project.
On the plus side, Dukakis isn't running, so that helps. Yeah, one thing I would say is, I mean, we're totally on the same page in terms of the importance of accuracy. I do think there's this fundamental tension between speed and accuracy, and I think everyone has the balance right, erring on the side of being 100% confident. One thing I will say at CBS is, luckily, my management understands that too and does not apply kind of unnecessary pressure. But one thing that helps is that our emphasis has changed slightly or evolved to do other things than just call races. A big part of the job is generating what I called earlier, like data-driven insights about the electorate, about how people vote, using surveys to explain why people are making the decisions they make. And basically, even when it comes to projections, walking people through the steps it takes the decision desk before we're at 100%, and that could be sharing things we're learning along the way. Or explaining, here's what we know and here's what we don't know, and the part we don't know, let's say how the mail ballots are going to break, is why we're not ready to make this projection yet. So increasingly that kind of explanation and color is a part of the job, and I think helps maybe alleviate some of the pressure to just tell us the answer right now.
Right. Awesome. Did you have, Scott, did you?
I was going to say what Kabir said, that's what we spend a lot of our time doing with a lot of our clients is, and I'm sorry, I wasn't watching the NBC broadcast, but like I imagine you told your folks, hey, we're waiting for Milwaukee, that was one of your trigger points. We had similar that we would communicate out, and one of our deals with our clients is we would provide on-the-record statements on when we called things and why we didn't. And that was the only that was the only thing we could do, and that kind of leads into the transparency thing, right? Like we're in this era where everyone's looking for someone to screw up, or everyone's looking for bias in media, whatever side it is, and we think the important job here is transparency. That's why it's kind of cheesy, but we had a camera up in our war room, right, so that people think we're real people. When we called Pennsylvania at 1:23 in the morning. That was 2 minutes later, I was grilled by Nexstar and Scripps stations, like, why did you call it before everyone else? And we had to answer and atone for that. And that's good, and that's what I think, what Kabir said, I imagine all the other networks is your job isn't here to just sit up here at the Wizard of Oz and be like, there's the projection. It's, nope, we're gonna come out here and explain why, and we're gonna be accountable if we're wrong.
So how do you all collaborate? Joe had mentioned there's a bridge where the networks communicate, and I know that each network has their own decision desk and are making their own independent decisions on when to project or have the information released publicly. But how do the networks work together? And for you, Scott, do you get involved in anything that NEP is doing, or how do you collaborate with your...
They will not let me on the bridge. Although I do have a question. I am going to throw the bomb. Like, do you guys, you all called it within 10 minutes of each other, right?
Yeah, well, I should say, the primary reason those people are on the bridge is we're all using the same data. It's the vote count data that Edison has been responsible for providing to the networks since 2017. And so the primary thing, probably much to Joe's chagrin, that's being discussed is questions from the members to Edison. The kinds of things you brought up before, like, are you sure about this county's vote results? Is it possible that it's actually early votes, not election day votes?
Are you throwing out random questions, though, to throw Lipinski off or something? I
probably should.
Because the competition, right? Like, if you're all on the same bridge, are you guys, I can't remember who called it first, but, are you pissed at the person? You're like, you asked a question. I didn't think you were going to do it.
I think, especially, if we're thinking about when we called the presidency, which I guess, all of us did in 5:30-ish.
10-minute
remember. We're in communication with you all, but I don't know when you guys call races on election night. And but in that particular call in Wisconsin, if you were listening to our conference bridge from about 4:30 until 5:30, it was basically silence, and then every few minutes somebody would be like, Joe, what's going on? When is Milwaukee reporting this data? Right? Those are the conversations we have. It's very boring, but we all know we're all looking for the same exact thing, right? even if we're not collaborating on these calls, we're doing them independently, we all were waiting for the same thing. And so when that thing happens, we all have our internal discussions and then we do it. And so that's how it ends up happening.
I knew what I needed to see out of that Milwaukee data. I'm sure you knew what you needed to see out of Milwaukee data. And we didn't talk about what that level was.
But it was probably the same thing.
But all we were talking about was, where's Milwaukee? So
when's it coming?
That's really it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's happening is that Edison is making projections. I don't know how much we've talked about that, but Edison has a decision team that's making projections, and Edison's members, clients have the option of taking that projection. So there are all sorts of news organizations, primarily through Reuters, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, which will take...
And the Washington Post separately.
Right, which will take your projections, just as many of the AP subscribers, just whatever the AP projects, that's what will go on their website or their broadcast.
And does that work the same way for you, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's funny. Reuters took our projections for a few from this cycle. We had to call Reuters up and remind them they got to cite us correctly. Yeah, no, at the end of the day, from a projection standpoint, you know, we're on a bridge, so to speak, with the clients. It's a lot of Slack these days because that's what they prefer. But we would get on a call with them. Like I said, it's more of it's a communicative out, not a why are we not calling it types of thing. If they have those questions, we answer them. But we have a very strict, like, we're not hearing, we don't want you to tell us to call something or anything like that. It's very communicative out. Most of it's done by Slack. And again, part of the reason for Slack is they like it better, but we also want a record of these things. It's kind of funny, when we called Pennsylvania 123, so about 20 minutes after Alaska. We can go over why we did that. But beforehand, we had 2 of our media clients have producers on site. And they could observe, they could ask us questions, they could, make sure everything's going already. And we came out and we said, look, we need to see these 1201 reports out of these few counties in Pennsylvania, and we think we're probably potentially a half hour, 45 minutes away from calling it, but just so you know, maybe we're not. And we have to be very careful with clients about those types of communications and things like that. And we did a lot of that in training, where when we did these dress rehearsals that everyone's talking about, we would tell them things like, in this scenario, it looks like Pennsylvania is ready to call in 10 minutes or something like that, and then we wouldn't. Right? So they got used to to get used to, like, the unexpectedness of election night, right? Like, because and we've learned this. You guys have all been in the TV world longer than we have, but what I've learned is if you tell a producer something, they think it's like gonna happen, right? And they think for some reason we know everything. Right, so if we told, like it's funny, we were doing our election night thing where we give our briefing of how we think election night's going to go, and I'm sure everyone it's like a TikTok, like, this is when this poll closed, this is when we think we're going to have this much vote, this is our best example. And on the document, I watermarked and I put it at the bottom, and I said, at least half, if not all of this will be wrong. Literally in there, and it said confidential, so that there wasn't a producer who could call me up and be like, you said North Carolina sometime between 9 and midnight, and it's 12:30, where is it? I think those are the types of communications and part of the training, and we've learned quite a bit is communicate that stuff out. Because again, it is important. We're not the ones communicating, it's the clients we have, so it's provide that narrative and that explanation, because I guess they got to sit there and bloviate for 6 hours on live television.
While we're waiting for the data.
Yeah.
So I'd like to switch the conversation to the future. Where do each of you see the future of election projections on election night, D-desks? I was thinking about AI, and everybody talks about all the amazing things that AI can do. Is AI going to get you out of a job, or what's going to happen? What do you think the future holds in the next, maybe foreseeable future, say the next election cycle?
I'm not an AI expert, so I think people mean different things by that term. But one thing I just want to reemphasize is what Joe said earlier, which is that we all have statistical models running on our computers. They're basically there to tell us, like, when to even pay attention to a race, because enough data is in, or the model has converged into a range where some human discussion is needed. It's really, I might just be, not forward-looking enough, but it's really hard for me to imagine replacing that step, that human in the loop, and that, even sophisticated models are built on assumptions, and it's really the job of analysts at the decision desk to understand those models inside out, because models are basically a simplification of the real world. You have to know what the model's assuming and what it's blind to. Just as an example that's more concrete, in 2020, how people were voting, whether they voted before Election Day or on Election Day, was an extremely important division in the electorate, with those groups having their own partisan skews. And models that were built at a time where that wasn't really an issue, you really had to understand that they were blind to this important factor. I mean, there are lots of wrinkles like that that I think are really important. So maybe someone really smart will come up with a machine learning algorithm that is taking all these important wrinkles in the data into account and spitting out the correct answer. But I mean, even there's going to be some level of risk. And so it's really hard for me to imagine that the humans getting replaced, although maybe I'm just wishfully thinking about my own job. One thing I will say, you mentioned AI. I feel like there's an opportunity for someone to use AI to do some kind of quality control for vote count data. You could train some sort of model on decades and decades of past vote returns, and at a minimum, it could maybe flag potential issues as the live data is coming in. That seems like a potentially good use of a new technology.
I would say the reason I think that AI isn't, again, maybe this is just wish casting, but that AI isn't going to replace the humans involved in this process is accountability. That if a network nowadays, if a network calls a presidential state wrong, heads have to roll. I mean, that's the reality, is somebody's getting fired, and if all of this was run...
Or even worse, they have to testify to Congress.
Well, yeah, I mean, literally in 2000, they have to testify in front of Congress. You can't have ChatGPT testify in front of Congress, right? There's not, that accountability piece doesn't exist in that world. Yeah, I do agree, though. I think the idea of utilizing those tools for other pieces of the process, like some of the data quality checking. I mean, one of the things that, to the question of like, what do we wish people understood more about this process, is just the reality that on election night, or on election day, there were hundreds of thousands of Americans working to tabulate these votes. There's 120,000 precincts across the country on election day, and all of those precincts have at least a handful of people working in those polling places. And the idea that when you have that many people, nobody is going to misread somebody else's handwriting or have fat fingers and type a wrong number is just, it's absurd to think that that would never happen. And so having better tools for detecting those issues that eventually get corrected, but the faster we can flag them to fix them, the better. I think that's a great point.
I was going to say, I suspect I may be the most pro model person up here, maybe not, but I'm a big fan, but I could not see any model replacing the human in the loop for race projections. And it's funny, so we did a live election model, like a New York Times needle, we called it the pulse, same thing. And the rule on the race call team is you can look at it, but I don't want to hear that's the reason why you're ready to call a race. Literally, the team that built it was not allowed to use it on election night. Because again, as someone who helped build it, it can't take into account human error. It hasn't seen all those things, all those different things. It's fun to look at. It's interesting. It maybe even provide a little bit of narrative, but it is not anywhere near ready to replace it. And I mean, I don't know. Never say never, but I don't see it coming anytime soon.
Okay, this is my last question, and then we're going to open the floor to everyone here to see if anybody has questions from the audience. So there are several students here today from Villanova, so go Nova. And what advice would you give to somebody who might be interested in pursuing a career that involves something like, getting involved in the decision, in a decision desk, or getting involved in election, the process on election night?
Send me an email. We do 4 fellowships a year. We pay real money. In fact, a lot of our race call team came out of fellowships, undergrad, grad students, and if they don't stick around, they go and do something else. Start volunteering. I bet all these guys have great internship programs or can figure out how to get involved. Just be aggressive on being involved.
I would say one of the best pieces of just general career advice that I got when I was younger was the best way to get admitted to grad school or to get a job or whatever it is to demonstrate that you're already doing the thing that they would be hiring you to do anyway. And so nowadays, there are people, a great example is Elliot Morris, who now runs 538. Elliot reached out to me when he was an undergrad because I was running this political analytics conference. And he, just as an undergrad, he was starting to do some of this election forecasting, and he had a blog out there, and he was just kind of putting this stuff out into the ether. But it provided, when he then was applying to he spent time working at The Economist, I'm pretty sure he was at, yeah. That he's able to point and say, look, you're gonna hire me to do this? I've been doing it for the last election cycle or two. And so just building up that work and making it public is a great way to get noticed.
I agree. If you're interested in politics or journalism, like, try your hand at writing. Ideally, it's something you can even point to and you build up a portfolio of sorts so that employers have examples of your work. But at a minimum, you'll learn a lot. You'll find your strengths, you'll find areas you need to improve. If you're interested in statistical modeling and you're learning Python, I came up learning R, and I always tell people it's great to have done classes on that or like a workshop, but what you really need to do is execute a project from start to finish, ideally something you're interested in and that you're a nerd about anyway, because that's where the real learning happens. And then, ideally that, again, even if it's not perfect, you can point to that to employers.
Python, not R, stata. Don't bring us any stata. So.
We're in our shop.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts from the panel before we open the floor to anybody with questions or phones? Okay. All right, so Jessica's got the microphone. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you to ask the question.
Thank you, and thank you for being here tonight. In 2000, about 4 or 5 in the morning, Al Gore made a phone call to George Bush and conceded the race. Who was the know-it-all that told him to do that? But more seriously, geez, talk about a bad call.
There's several long reports that each network wrote on what information was used
Yes.
at that time. So
Several books.
I just,
Oh, man.
what
I
I
was
want to,
like, don't you know the guy, Joe?
at CNN, every member of our decision team reads our 2000 Florida report before every election so that we do not make
All right.
the same mistakes again.
Wow.
Our team watched Recount the weekend before. If we had a 2000 report, we'd definitely make them read it. But yes, that is yes, we talk
I remember
about
there
that
was
a
a
lot.
gym in Philadelphia that had a sign that said, "The best gym in America, Florida votes not included." But seriously, on the night before the election, did any one of the five of you know one person that correctly called all 7 swing states?
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, but I wasn't. Well, I don't know how to say this without sounding mean. That didn't impress. That wouldn't impress me that much. It is so like there. By call, I assume you mean people before the election who forecast the way those states would go. So I'm not that immersed in the pre-election forecast, but from what I saw, they were all pointing to a pretty close race. So like if they put it in probabilistic terms, it's kind of a coin flip that Trump or Harris would win. The other thing is, well, I was just about to say, so like I believe 538's modal outcome. So they run a bunch of statistical simulations where they're predicting the outcome of every state. That's not Nate Silver anymore, but he founded it. It's actually Elliot, who Stephen mentioned. So I got coffee with him. So to answer your question, I didn't know this before the election, but it was pointed out to me a few days ago, that the modal outcome, meaning in their simulations, the thing that happened most often was Trump winning all 7 swing states. And I think any responsible consumer of pre-election polls would, you have to know that these are not laser precise instruments. They're trying to estimate a population that doesn't yet exist. And they did a pretty good job this year. And all I was going to say is that a responsible consumer of those polls should know that that outcome, even if you're not looking at 5:30 at our forecast, was well within the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, and no model, no pre-election poll, no exit poll, no model we do is going to have the precision to say Trump is going to win Wisconsin by 29,638 votes or whatever the final margin is. So I don't think that's the way to
or
judge.
Arizona by 10,000 votes. I'm
yeah,
gonna say it.
Yeah, so, to judge.
I love
these
you,
models,
Arnon.
The judgment here is, does it give you the big picture that these states are going to be close and in many cases leading in Trump's direction, but you cannot, with any of the tools that we have, predict a margin when it's fractions of a point like that.
One more question. Once Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are called, I mean, the probability is close to zero that Harris is going to pull this out, correct?
Correct.
Well, it was absolutely zero because we had already called Georgia and North Carolina.
Yeah,
so
because Georgia,
he was-
and by that time, we had called Georgia.
we
and
had
North, yeah.
projected 270 by the time we called
Yeah.
Wisconsin. So, yes.
But by the time he had won Georgia and North Carolina, it was about an 85% chance he was going to win. One thing to add on to Kabir, because it's one thing to be right, it's one thing to know you're right. So the night before the election, our public forecast had 6 of the 7 states right going into election day. And I was asked about it, and I was like, I don't know. It's a statistical model. I don't know if it's right or not. It's a probability either way. So you could argue that our model was very good, and it was, but I was telling people, I was like, I don't know, it could go either way. So you got to believe it, not necessarily call it.
PDHQ was the first to call the presidential election.
Yes.
But in 2020, who was it? Chris Firewall got fired for correctly calling Arizona.
Well, we called it first in 2022. We're still here.
Well,
2020 as well, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
an interesting philosophical question. Is the call correct because it ended up being right by 10,000 votes? Or was the call incorrect because it gave a false narrative that was an easy call? That was not a call that should have been made at the time it was made. We did not know enough information at that time, and we held off for several days because we knew it was going to get really, really close. So how do you judge a projection, or how do you judge a model? Is it because it got all 50 states right, or because it knew when to make the call, when we knew with 100% certainty that a state was going to end up that way? So I would challenge the assertion that that was a correct call. It just ended up being the right winner, but it was not the way we call races. We will only call races when we have 100% certitude, and they, in retrospect, didn't.
Do you have another question?
Yes. You were asking a question about, what shocked you. I think a lot of us were shocked at how quickly this happened. You guys, the media, kind of primed us and said this is going to take a couple days, and it didn't. So were you really as surprised as we were that it happened so quickly?
Again, I guess mildly. The thing is, we were setting people up, we were making sure expectations were aligned, so to speak. So we were preparing people for the possibility. In 2020, it took us until the Saturday after Election Day. So we were really saying it could be anything in between. But for sure, a very late election night call or in the wee hours of Wednesday morning was one of those scenarios. So I can't say I was that surprised. It was one we were planning on. I think a couple of factors led to it being projectable at that hour. One is the fact that Trump won, swept enough swing states by that time where he had hit the 270 electoral votes needed. But there were also, I think, improvements in vote tabulation across a lot of the important states, Pennsylvania being one of them. So that part of that is just technology going to some of the big populous counties that allowed them to process results quickly. So I think those two things combined, 2020 was weird in a lot of ways. It was a historic disruption to election administration, a lot of rules changes, new procedures people were getting used to. And it feels like between the 22 midterms and this year, there's been kind of a bit of a return to normal, and we'll be in a new equilibrium for how elections are run and how the results are reported out.
Other questions over here?
Hi, if I may ask this question, do you think in our lifetime we will ever see a national popular vote? And I ask this because I met directly with the grassroots director of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. She resides in the state of Washington, and as I understand it from her directly, her mouth, they are visiting states one by one and getting the states to agree to put a statute in place so we won't have the winner takes all model. And for this rest of the people in the room, we are currently up to 196 electoral votes of states willing to go this route. So we're only 74 electoral votes worth statewide shy of getting this to essentially collapse the electoral college. Because once they get the remaining 74 states worth of electoral votes, they're all going to put this statute into law. And if they do, in theory, that should just, by doing that, collapse the electoral college. Do you think we'll see that in our lifetime?
No. I mean, the compact is an interesting way to get around the constitutional provisions of the Electoral College, because there is no way you can convince 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 38 states to ratify a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. The compact has a few issues they've got to jump over. One is they don't have enough states that have agreed to it. As you said, there's 74 electoral votes away. There's also very likely it would be challenged constitutionally, and you'd have the Supreme Court making a ruling on that. So you not only need the states, you need 5 members of the Supreme Court to sign off on it as well. And the issue is a candidate that wins 270 electoral votes is going to win 270 electoral votes. You can't, the states that went for Trump are never going to join this compact. So as much as they're going around the country asking for these states to join, the states that voted for Trump are not going to join that compact, in my opinion. Other people might differ, but that's
maybe
that's
if
my
Kamala had won the battleground states and lost the popular vote, then maybe in our lifetimes. But no, typically, generally, I agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. Although if it did, we'd really dislike California and how slow they count.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things the Electoral College does is it gives us a marker, 270 electoral votes, so we can call the race. You know, on election night, 20 million votes are not counted on
Easily,
election night.
yeah.
We're still waiting for the last 2 or 3 million votes from California, Washington, Maryland, and these states that count slowly. Think of how much tension there would be in the country right now if we were talking about margins of 10 or 15 or 20,000 votes nationally, and we were waiting for counties in California and Maryland and Washington to report their vote.
Think about what happens when the national popular vote is narrow enough that every state is doing a recount simultaneously under all different rules in every
that'd
state.
be awesome.
Like, can you imagine? Like, 2000 was wild with just Florida doing a recount, but can you imagine all 50 states doing that? I mean, I can't even. Yeah.
I think that's why the House was more difficult too, because you're not counting at the state level, and those races, some of those races.
Yeah,
just
we
were
still
not
have 5 races
counted.
we haven't
Yeah.
called. And there's one in California. It's 36 vote margin. Yeah.
Another question over here.
Hey, I had a quick question about how you all handle like emerging battlegrounds. So you talked about like safe states and the battleground states, but like, so I voted in New Jersey. New Jersey probably took the star of the show of being the like late arriving 4-point race at the end of the day. But some networks called it with exits and no returns. So I'm just curious how you all handled that. I remember seeing New Jersey came in like, I think after like around Pennsylvania time.
We did not call New Jersey based on the exit poll. We waited till
Yeah, we waited
real
for votes too.
So you can, by deduction, you can determine who did call it based on their survey, but it wasn't us on this stage.
Would it be surprising that you had to wait for it, considering that it was a state that had a legacy of being a blue state?
Yeah, but we've put procedures in place that when we're surprised like that.
I mean, we're cautious on anything that's less. I mean, we're cautious on everything. But anything that's even a 20-point race, a 60-40 race, we're hesitant to touch until we're absolutely certain that it's going to be a 20-point race. And
Right.
New Jersey falls squarely within that, and it did before this election, or at least close to that threshold.
Yes, and we did, of course, have the gubernatorial race there just a couple of years ago as a solid indicator that strong Republican performance is possible in New Jersey.
One thing to consider, and I'm maybe these guys can comment, but like, there's like no reason to insta-call a race other than some clients are like, okay, well, can you tell us something to say at the top of the hour, right? And so like our list, I think at the end of the day was like, it started in June with like 100, and by election night, it was because we were like Xing it off, like, all right, let's wait 10 minutes to see some votes or half hour, what do we care, right? Because New Jersey at 4 points, Virginia, all that other kind of stuff. The only people who want at 8 o'clock are clients with media, concerns. I don't think anyone on this stage cares about waiting 20 minutes or an hour for Jersey.
No, yeah, and to put it another way, nobody's on pins and needles about whether or not the Democrats win New Jersey, because if we call it, then it's not a surprise, and if we don't call it, then it's a signal that the Republicans are doing well, and so the act of not calling it can potentially send a signal that this is a good Republican night, or you could say it in the reverse way. If we didn't call Kansas for a long time, then it sends the signal in the other direction.
And I think the key here too is that the decisions are data driven, and so a lot of the decisions are not being made because of our intuition or our gut, but because of the fact that the data are showing patterns, and it's clear from each of the panelists that are here tonight that there were patterns that were emerging through the night, through the data.
Yeah, I had a colleague who had a sign up by their desk a few years back that said, Donald Trump is the president and Alabama has a Democratic senator. You don't know what's going to happen. And I really take that lesson to heart in everything that we do.
So we have another question?
Yeah. With Pennsylvania, you mentioned that, Scott, you mentioned about calling it at 1:20 or 30 in the morning. What was the trigger that said, okay, now I'm going to call that? Was it a particular county or election district?
So it was a couple of things. Biggest thing for us is, and this is why I think it's intermediate algebra, right? We've got to be confident on candidate A having so many votes, candidate B having so many votes, and then the hardest variable is like how many votes are left, right? And so those are the three variables we're trying to solve on election night. That third variable is always the hardest in terms of, because we may even know the number. We may have a pretty good idea of the number left, but then you got to know where it is. Is it in Philadelphia? Is it in, is it in western rural Pennsylvania, those types of things. And so what was very helpful to us on election night was these 1201 reports, which is a new thing that Al Schmidt put together and required these counties. And by 1201, each county had to report out how many votes they had left to count. And then the state said that they were going to report it out and aggregate it up at 1 o'clock. And so one of the things we did is we picked about 24 counties in which we thought, hey, we would really like to know these things. And so we had extra on-the-ground reporters wait outside, credentialed these counties, and asked for the reports. Not everyone got one, but we were able to get them, and we got a good early look at some of them around 10:30, 11, got even more around 11:30 or 12, and then guess what? The state did their job, and they posted it publicly around 12:30. And so about 12:30, we had a pretty good idea of where we thought the outstanding vote was. And then we started going through our process of, okay, where do we think all the vote goals are for each of the different candidates? So we went through all the vote goals and we looked at the trends, and then we determined right around 1 o'clock that we were ready to go. And then I said, no, we're not ready to go. We had the two, right? So we went back and we made sure that we had it right on these reports. We made sure we had it right on the counties in which are trigger points. And then we all took a deep breath and said, okay, we now have our reasoning, and we reported out that way. But that was, it was basically, we were able to call Pennsylvania because the elections officials did their job, and they did it well. Because that's all we're doing. All we're doing is taking their data and putting it out there. If they don't provide it, that's fine. We have to wait till they provide it.
Thank you.
Other questions? Did you have another question? No. Okay. All right.
All righty, well, let's give a round of applause. Thanks again for your time and attention. There is a VU basketball game that starts at 7, so if you're wondering why people were filing out, they're probably going to watch the game. So for those that are, not itching to get to the game, there is a hosted happy hour happening at the refectory that starts at 7. That's being sponsored very graciously by the Pennsylvania and New Jersey chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. So if you want to come talk to the panelists learn more about them. There's other people in the audience that are part of the polling community as well that are here. If you want to come and mingle, we can definitely, mingle over there at 7. You can even watch the game. It should be on TV. So again, join us there if you'd like, and have a great night. Thanks for your time.